Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajagacharya Shudrashata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Abhayachanara Vinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajagacharya Shudrashata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Samavita Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Today we are reading from Canto 3, Chapter 22, the marriage of Kardama Muni and Devahuti. Okay, it's a book marked wrong. 3:14:15. Okay, wrong book. Anyway, we can start. Atha me kuru kalyanam. Atha me kuru kalyanam. Kamam kamalalochana. Kamam kamalalochana. Artopasarpanam bhuman. Artopasarpanam bhuman. Amogam hi mahiyasi. Amogam hi mahiyasi. Atha me kuru kalyanam. Kamam kamalalochana. Artopasarpanam bhuman. Amogham hi mahiyasi. Arthopasarpanam bhuman. Amogham hi mahiyasi. Atha me kuru kalyanam. Kamam kamalalochana. Arthopasarpanam bhuman. Amogham hi mahiyasi. Atha, therefore, may unto me, Kuru, kindly do, Kalyanam, benediction, Kamam, desire, Kamalalochana, O lotus-eyed one, Artha, of the distressed, Upasarpanam, the approaching, Bhuman, O great one, Amogham, without failure, he, certainly, mahiyasi, to a great person. Translation, purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation, O lotus-eyed one, kindly bless me by fulfilling my desire. When someone in distress approaches a great person, his pleas should never go in vain. Purport, Diti knew well that her request might be rejected because of the untimely situation. But she pleaded that when there is an emergency or a distressful condition, There is no consideration of time or situation. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashlakaya Chakshulmilitam Yena Tasmaya Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Rugnathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamshcha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Deenabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapte Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vansha Kalpatarubhyasya Kripa Sindhu Bhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasari Gaur Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So I wanted to bring your attention from the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam to the third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. We touched upon it last week a little bit when I was giving the class, but I thought that today we could delve deeper into the topic of the enemy of the soul. Here we see that DT is in a distressful situation, and Srila Prabhupada is also saying when there's an emergency or distressful condition, there's no consideration of time or situation. So she's feeling the need to approach her husband, and both of them know that it's not the right time, and both of them know that the consequence will be disastrous, will be distressful for both of them. Yet they're being pushed. So Arjuna asks that question to Lord Krishna towards the end of the third chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Why are we impelled to sinful acts as if by force? So my spiritual master, he mentions that this is he uses the phrase victimization of the material energy. Just like you're just doing something, going about doing your thing, and all of a sudden something just comes and hits you out of nowhere. It's like, he gives the example actually, that when he was younger, him and his brother, they were walking home from school, and his brother was something like 10 or 11 years old. He was about 2 years older than his brother, so they're in primary school. And his brother had already reached home. But as he was coming home, my spiritual master, as he was coming home, he saw that in his front yard there was holes dug up everywhere. And he said to his younger brother, "What is this? You've destroyed the front yard. What are you doing here? What on earth are you doing here?" And he said, "Me and my friends are hiding from the girls. We don't want to get girls' germs." And then a few years later, he was coming back home from school, and then this time on the front lawn of his house, he sees a whole group of boys in a circle, and they're all cheering. And he sees his brother is there, and he's in the center of this ring. That same brother who was digging the holes a couple of years back. And he pushes all these guys aside, and he goes to the center, he holds his brother, and he says, "What on earth are you doing this time?" And his younger brother says that me and this boy I'm fighting with, we like the same girl. So my spiritual master uses this example to show us, to demonstrate how material energy, how Maya victimizes us. Just a couple of years back, he was not interested in such a thing, but then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, you could say a physical reason like hormones. Here we're talking about lust, the mind, the uncontrolled mind, and the lusty intelligence as well. Krishna says further in the Gita that lust hides in three places: the mind, the lusty intelligence, as well as the senses. I remember also a personal example. I was about 8 years old, 7 or 8 years old, and I remember at that time we had little toy figurines of little robots or something like that. And me and my friend, I think we were in year 2 that time. Me and my friend used to, after finishing school, I would go to his house almost every day, and we would play with these toys. And I remember both of our imaginations were very vivid. He would have his toy, I would have my toy, and we'd battle each other and fight with each other. And we would think, some enemy is coming from there, and we have to cross this bridge and do all these things. And then we'd have really vivid imagination. And that would assist us in our playing with our toy figurines. And I remember the day coming home from school again, not too long after that. I might have been 9, 10 years old, I can't remember. Coming home, going to his house, and then again, he got his toy figurine, I got my toy figurine, and all of a sudden, it just wasn't interesting anymore. I remember that very moment where I just thought, it's just not interesting anymore. I got to do something else. So then later on, we started playing computer games at his house, and then we started getting into sports, cricket and soccer and all that sort of stuff. So you can see you're doing an activity that you like to do. It's a great time pass. You love it, but then all of a sudden, things change. And it's just not interesting anymore. So this is a very apt phrase, victimization of the material energy. But, before I get into this, the difference between lust, which is the enemy that we're talking about here, and love is clearly defined in Chaitanya Charitamrita, the very famous verse. You all know it. Atmendriya priti vancha bale tare kam. Krishnendriya priti icha dhare prema nam. So there it's very vividly described. That sense gratification is eternally existing. It's an eternal fact. It's not false like the Mayavadis say. When you desire to satisfy your own senses, that is defined as lust, separate from Krishna. But when you desire to exclusively satisfy the senses of Krishna, that is defined as love. Now, when we talk about Krishnendriya Priti Icha, does that mean that we're only going to Krishna and satisfying his senses? Like we're getting some bhoga and we're feeding Krishna, or we're massaging the soft baby leaf, soft body of Krishna, or we're dressing Krishna. Okay, these are direct sensual activities which are pleasing the senses of Krishna. But don't forget that Krishna is Rishikesha. He's the master of everyone's senses. He's the proprietor of everyone's senses. And that's why, even if you satisfy your own senses, not necessarily directly Krishna's senses, but even if you satisfy your senses in connection with Krishna, that is also love as well. If you eat for Krishna, if you bathe properly, dress properly for Krishna's pleasure, if you sleep for Krishna, do service for Krishna, whatever. This is actually your own senses, right? It seems like you're satisfying your own senses, but the purpose is different. It's to satisfy Krishna. So it's both directly serving Krishna's senses, as well as serving your own senses, but in connection with Krishna. This is also known as love. And one practical example of this comes to my mind. Like the first time I went to Vrindavan with some of the devotees in the ashram was back in 2014. I remember we had a book distribution marathon. I think it was our second book distribution marathon. And that was the perk. The perk was that whoever comes in the top 2, 3 in the book distribution marathon, we would get to go to Vrindavan. So somehow, I didn't come in the top 2 or 3. It was Ganesham Prabhu and one other devotee. But then I remember speaking to Ganesham Prabhu one day about Vrindavan and how nice it is, and he said, okay, just come along. So I sort of tagged along. And on the last day there, we did the Govardhan Parikrama. And I remember at that time we were like, okay, let's do it barefoot, like everyone else was doing. Let's do it barefoot. So we did it barefoot, and I remember Mohit Prabhu was there as well. He was showing us around. And Ganesham Prabhu was in front, the other devotees were in front, Mohit Prabhu was in front, I was just at the back. the stones were starting to really prick my feet after just a couple of kilometers. And it's something like 21 kilometers, the whole parikrama. It was very difficult. Somehow I finished. We started way early in the morning, like 8 o'clock in the morning, and we finished at 9:30 at night. So we stopped here and there, we talked to some sadhus, we did a little bit of sightseeing like that. But for me, half of my attention was going to my feet. So then a couple of years later, we went back to Vrindavan. And this time on that trip, we did Govardhan Parikrama twice. But then the point was raised that our service to Krishna is, like at least my service, some of the brahmacharis, we're book distributors, we're full-time distributing books for Radha Gopinath, and we have to take care of our legs. If we destroy our feet for the sake of doing Govardhan Parikrama and we get blisters and bruises, then that will affect our service when we come back for a week or two. So then we decided to do the same Govardhan Parikrama but wearing slippers or Crocs or whatever, footwear. Now it seems like it's sense gratification. You're not placing your feet on the soft sand of Raja. No, but we did it putting in mind our service to Radha Gopinath. So that is also a symptom or an example of love for Krishna, prema. Even though we were satisfying our own sense of touch, still we did it for a different purpose. The Acharyas explain, they analyze the situation of a devotee who is fighting with this enemy, with this monster known as lust. Srila Prabhupada and the Acharyas compare the devotees to two different scenarios. Specifically, Srila Prabhupada says that the devotee who's fighting lust can be compared to a patient in a hospital. The patient admits himself to the hospital because the patient knows that they have a disease. So at least they're humble enough, they're intelligent enough to understand that they're diseased. Once they go to the hospital, they are determined to overcome the disease by following the prescriptions of the doctor. So Srila Prabhupada compared this ISKCON institution to a hospital. And we are all the patients. And we're all sick with the disease of lust to various degrees. So we can't expect everyone's just a pure devotee. We have to understand different devotees are on different levels, but we're all sadhus in the sense, just as Krishna says in the Gita, that we are on the right path. And there may be stumbling blocks, there may be setbacks, slips, fall downs, but as long as you remain fixed in devotional service and Krishna consciousness, Krishna says you are to be considered saintly, you are to be considered a sadhu. So that is one example. A devotee is compared to a patient. The Acharyas explain that and Srila Prabhupada was explaining some verses before. Remember when he compared Vidura to be a warrior? So similarly along these lines, a devotee is also compared to be like a warrior. The warrior goes on the battlefield, and if the warrior is a real Kshatriya, yadrichaya labha santushta swargam dvaram apavarta. It mentions in the Gita that fortunate are those Kshatriyas for whom a fighting opportunity comes unsought. Because this fighting opportunity, which is based on dharmic principles, is the gateway for them to enter the heavenly planets. So the devotee sees opportunities to fight with Maya, to fight with lust, as an opportunity to take one more step towards Krishna. So the devotee can also be compared to a great warrior on a battlefield. Now, I was hearing some time back a lecture by Kadamba Kanana Maharaj, and he was talking about the pastime of King Nala. Now, King Nala is the husband of the famous Damayanti, And this story is often told for another reason. It's used to glorify the chastity and the faithfulness of Damayanti. But Maharaj was explaining the story from another angle, from another context. And what is that context? The context is how lust can enter into our minds when we are not careful. Just like Srila Prabhupada says, right? Advancement on the spiritual path is just like walking on the edge of a razor blade. If you're not careful, if you're inattentive, Srila Prabhupada says, you will slip and it will be nasty. So we have to always be on alert to look out for this lust monster. And specifically the story is about Kali Purusha and how he enters. Like, some verses back we were talking about Brahma. Not some chapters back we were talking about Brahma creating the sarga of the Visarga creation, right? Now, do you remember what comes from the back of Lord Brahma? Any idea what was manifested from Brahma's back? Adharma. Now, it's mentioned, Maharaj was mentioning that Kali Purusha is one of the descendants of Adharma. And Kali Purusha married harsh speech. So the wife of Kali Purusha is harsh speech. So it's a good combination. So this Kali Purusha, I'll tell you the story. So basically, King Nala, I don't think he was a devotee of the Supreme Personality of God, but he was a pious king. He was a Nishada king, a king of the Nishada tribes, very influential. And one day he heard that this princess Damayanti was holding her own Swayamvara. Right? So Swayamvara, I think, was it in yesterday's purport? I was talking about Swayamvara. Anyway. Yeah, so she was a princess. She wanted to choose her own husband in a Swayamvara ceremony. So King Nala heard about this proposal, and he was walking on his way to attend the Swayamvara. Probably, I'm guessing it was somewhere far away because it was taking some days to reach this particular place where Damayanti was. So he's going with the intention to marry Damayanti to the Swayamvara, and along the way, he meets King Indra. And wow, just imagine, you're just walking and then King Indra just comes to your path, right? Bright, effulgent, dazzling, and then the king of the demigods. And then immediately King Nala, he pays obeisances to Indra, and he says, "Oh, my dear King Indra, I for my respectful obeisances to you, please tell me what is your desire. I can fulfill anything that you request. Please tell me." King Indra says that when you go and meet Princess Damayanti, tell her that I want to marry her. Now just get this. Nala is going with the intention to marry Damayanti, and King Indra is telling the same Nala, tell her that I want to marry her instead. So he says to Indra, but I want to marry her actually. And then King Indra says, hey, you promised me that you'll do whatever I want. So go and tell her. So he goes and he manages to meet Princess Damayanti one day before the actual Swayamvara ceremony takes place. So he meets her and he tells her that, Indra, I met Indra and he's saying that he wants to marry you. But then Damayanti says, forget about King Indra. Forget about any of the demigods. I'm actually attracted to you, King Nala. I want to marry you. So go and tell this to King Indra, that I'm not interested. I actually want to marry you. So you can just imagine how scared he is. He goes back and in a very honorable, truthful way, he tells to King Indra that Damayanti said that she actually wants to marry me, not you. King Indra says, okay, fine. Now, this is the part of the story which is glorified the most, or the most commonly told. On the day of the actual Swayamvara, King Nala comes. Along with King Nala comes Indra to the Swayamvara, knowing very well that Damayanti is not interested in King Indra. And along with King Indra comes two other demigods. Agni is there and Vayu is there. But here's the thing. All four of them look like King Nala. Or rather, all three of them look exactly like King Nala. They use their demigod siddhis, their shape-shifting abilities, to transform themselves to look exactly like King Nala. So you have the original King Nala, and then you have three demigods which look exactly like King Nala. that is when Damayanti prays to Lord Vishnu. She prays to the Supreme Personality of Godhead that if my devotion to you, if my chastity, if my faithfulness is anything to go by, then please, Lord Vishnu, allow me to pick the actual King Nala so that my religious principles will not be violated. And Lord Vishnu helps her, and she ends up choosing, the proper King Nala, the original King Nala. And then, in a Kshatriya way, everyone's like, okay, fine, you are the rightful person. We respect Damayanti's decision. Damayanti marries Princess Damayanti, King Nala, sorry. And then the other three demigods, they go away. And no hard feelings. They go back to the heavenly planets. They're enjoying there. But this is when, so Maharaj was talking about this point. This is what he emphasized. This is the part of the story which we don't hear too much. We know about King Nala, he gets involved in gambling and all these things, sinful activities. But how it actually happens is like this. Kali Purusha approaches Lord Indra in the heavenly planets. In some Shastras, Maharaj explains that Kali Purusha is known as one of the lower celestials, one of the lower, I guess demigods or something like that. He calls it celestials. So he approaches King Indra and he gives him disinformation. He speaks bad things against King Nala into his ear. And it reminded me of the same situation of Manthara talking to Kaushalya, Kaikeyi, about how her son, Bharata, should be the king rather than Lord Ramchandra. So in the same way, he influenced King Indra. And he said, look, here we have a mortal man, a human being, King Nala. How is it that he could stand up to demigods, to celestials? How dare he come in between you, Agni and Vayu, and take away this princess? You should have the rightful claim to this princess. You are great demigods. Then he influenced King Indra. And he said to King Indra, look, if you want, I will go and corrupt him. I will go out and corrupt his intelligence, his mind, like that. And King Indra, being influenced by his speech, his harsh speech, he says, okay, tatastu, go. So on Indra's order, it's mentioned, Maharaj mentions that Kali Purusha actually started following King Nala around. And he waited for the right opportunity that when King Nala made some mistake because of inattention in his religious duties, in his ritualistic activities, whatever he was doing, at that point Kali Purusha would take opportunity. Just like King Indra did the same to, was it Aditi? Aditi, when she was doing the Payo Vrata vow. So in the same way, Diti. She wanted a son that could kill Indra. So in the same way, Kali Purusha is following King Nala, and Maharaj mentions one day that's what happens. King Nala, he forgets to wash his feet or something like that. Something really small happens, and Kali Purusha takes this opportunity to enter into the consciousness or the mind, the subtle body of King Nala. And that is the reason why King Nala becomes implicated in all sorts of sinful activities, particularly gambling. And then he gambles, and he loses his kingdom. And this great king, he has nothing left. He goes to the forest, and there he meets his queen, Damayanti, and he tells her, look, I have no more wealth left, I have no more followers, no more kingdom. How can I take care of you? I can't do that. So then he renounces her as well. And Maharaj says that all the while, he is thinking that it's his doing, it's his intelligence which is acting in terms of all the gambling activities that he did and how he lost everything. Nala is thinking that he's the one that's actually doing this. But Maharaj is saying it's actually the influence of Kali. Now, we can take this in the wrong way. We can say, if I get involved in sinful activity, it's not my fault. It's Kali Yuga's fault. No. But the point we have to understand is that it was because King Nala was inattentive in his religious practices. Kali took that opportunity of inattention and slackness to enter and influence. Therefore, if we are inattentive, if we are slack in our practice of Krishna consciousness, then that is an opportunity for Kali Yuga to come and start to influence us. But Srila Prabhupada mentions that even if Kali enters, if we still strictly follow Srila Prabhupada's instructions of chanting attentively and inoffensively, Srila Prabhupada always used to stress inoffensive chanting, 16 rounds. Okay, so not just 16 rounds, but we have to endeavor to chant inoffensively. 16 rounds, and following the 4 regulated principles, then we can defeat this Kali Yuga. And specifically he talks about, he gives the example of Haridas Thakur as well. If we associate with devotees like Haridas Thakur and constantly chant the holy name, then we can defeat this monster of lust. There's one of the famous purports in Bhagavatam where Srila Prabhupada talks about that. Now, let me just, because that's one point of the purport, right? It's talking about, or rather the context is that both Diti and Kashyapa, they're being influenced by this lust monster. And in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is emphasizing about the emergency situation. Now, this emergency situation is something which all of us patients, all of us warriors are facing right now. We have to defeat this monster known as lust. That is an emergency situation. Krishna has defined that the lust is our eternal enemy here in this mature world. And in terms of the mood, this is a verse, I think it's from the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Yes. Canto 11, chapter 9, text number 29. It talks about material existence, and it's a verse that the Avadut Brahman quoted in the 11th canto. And mind you, this is a verse which, when Srila Prabhupada's spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, when he used to quote this verse, he used to get emotional. Amarendra Prabhu was mentioning that when Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would quote this verse, he would start to cry. So hear this. Labdha sudurlabhamidam bahusambhavante manusyamartadam nityamapi hadhira turnam yatetana patedanu mrityu yavan nishreshasaya vishayakulu sarvatasyat. Translation: after many, many births and deaths, one achieves the rare human form of life, which, although temporary, affords one the opportunity to attain the highest perfection. So we shouldn't take this human form of life as something cheap. We've attained it after millions and millions of lifetimes. And it affords us the opportunity to achieve the highest perfection. Thus, a sober human being should quickly endeavor for the ultimate perfection of life. Why? As long as his body, which is always subject to death, has not fallen down and died. After all, sense gratification is available even in abominable species, whereas Krishna consciousness is possible only for a human being. So, it describes, I've heard this from some devotees in lectures. They used to mention that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had this real mood of urgency when it came to spreading Krishna consciousness. And we see that when Srila Prabhupada went and met him for the first time with his friend. What did Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur say? He said, this Krishna consciousness cannot wait for the independence of India. It has to act now. This knowledge has to be spread right now. There's no time for you to join Gandhi's movement of the independence of India, he told to Abhay Charan at that point in time. Take this mission up, preach this message, especially in the English-speaking countries, and he told him to print books. You're good at English, I noticed that, I've taken note of you. Abhay Charan is a very attentive listener, and he's good at the English language, so print these books in English and distribute them far and wide. So that is the urgency consciousness that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was in. And Srila Prabhupada, by circumstance, was also placed in such a situation of urgency. Right? We know Srila Prabhupada, by material terms, was very old. In the ship itself, he suffered a heart attack and a stroke. He didn't know how long he was going to live for in this world. He wrote Srimad Bhagavatam in a sense of urgency. He sacrificed his health, he sacrificed his own sleep. He preached during the whole day, right? And when everyone else went to sleep, Srila Prabhupada would sleep for a few hours, and he would sacrifice his sleep and wake up at 12 o'clock, at 1 o'clock. And in that sense of urgency, he would write, or rather dictate, the purports of Srimad Bhagavatam. So Srila Prabhupada, also following in the footsteps of his spiritual master, was in that sense of urgency. And we know Srila Prabhupada gave initiation, sannyas, Brahman Diksha to so many disciples. And sometimes Srila Prabhupada was criticized for that. But we can see Srila Prabhupada's urgency, and we can see what he achieved. So this sense of urgency is needed, because if we don't have that sense of urgency, it's very difficult to defeat lust. It's like the enemy is always there. Maya is always influencing us here in this mature world. So if we don't proactively do something about our spiritual life, more and more, ever increasing, incrementally, exponentially, do something to defeat Maya, then Maya will take us over. It's a very crude example. I'm not sure if you played these games, but when I was a really young kid, I had a Sega Mega Drive, and I used to play Sonic the Hedgehog. And in some of the levels there, the screen would continuously move forward. And if your character, if Sonic the Hedgehog, if he touched the end of the screen, in other words, if you didn't keep moving past all the obstacles, if the screen hit you at the end, then he would die for some reason. So it reminds me of that. It's like Maya is continuously pushing us, and if we don't proactively do something to increase the depth of our Krishna consciousness, to go deeper, then she will take us over. So if we are satisfied by our level of Krishna consciousness, if we are satisfied with our progress that we've made so far, then that's not good enough. We should always compare ourselves to devotees who are doing much greater, doing much higher. If we just compare ourselves to devotees who are starting out, or devotees who are even on our equal platform, which is good, but we should also compare ourselves with great devotees, pure devotees, and we should endeavor to follow in their footsteps and not be complacent. Now, the solution to this lust, Krishna mentions, it's the last text of the 3rd chapter, and I'll finish with this point. Evam buddhe param baddha samstabhyatman atmana jahi shatrum mahabhav kama rupam durasadam. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind and intelligence, in other words, knowing that you're not the body, you're not your mind, you're not your intelligence. O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence. Srila Prabhupada says in a purport, a couple of verses before, that the intelligence is the next door neighbor of the soul. If your intelligence has an infatuation with the false ego, then that's going to affect the soul. The soul is going to start identifying itself with the lusty intelligence and with the false ego, and that's what leads to this whole sense gratification. So, Krishna is telling Arjuna, steady your mind. How? By deliberate spiritual intelligence, in brackets, Srila Prabhupada has put Krishna consciousness. And thus, by spiritual strength, conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. And I think there's one more really inspiring verse. Yeah, this is text number 41 of the 3rd chapter. Krishna says to Arjuna, therefore, O Arjuna, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning, curb this great symbol of sin, in brackets, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Lust is the destroyer of transcendental knowledge and realization. It impels us to do sinful things without even us desiring to do them. It takes away our intelligence, as Krishna mentions in the 2nd chapter of the Gita, the fall down process. So Srila Prabhupada was one day walking in America on one of the beaches there, and you probably heard of Dr. Stilson Judah. He's one of the professors. I think he was an emeritus professor at some university. So he asked Srila Prabhupada, "Dear Srila Prabhupada, this lust is a great problem. How can we conquer this lust?" Srila Prabhupada continued walking on the beach, and then all of a sudden, Srila Prabhupada slammed his cane down into the sand. He made a crater into the sand. The sand went poof. And Srila Prabhupada turned around and he said, "You can only defeat lust by Krishna consciousness." And then he kept silent. And then he walked again for like a minute. Everyone was quiet. Again, Srila Prabhupada dug his cane into the sand and he said, "Only if you cultivate Krishna consciousness can you defeat lust. No other way." So there, one of the devotees who recounted this incident, he was saying that Srila Prabhupada went on to explain that we can organize our life in so many external ways to defeat lust. For example, not eating heavy, rich foods at night, whatever. Like that, right? We can do so many things to externally to avoid it. But Srila Prabhupada is saying, whatever you do on the outside doesn't matter. You have to, on the inside, cultivate Krishna consciousness. And that is the only way that you can destroy lust. So on the inside, how pure are we? How much are we? Gaur Govinda Maharaj says that the prerequisite, ideally, for taking sannyas is that when you chant Hare Krishna, Krishna has to come into your mind. That is the stage that we have to try to reach. That when we chant Hare Krishna, Krishna has to come into our mind. Our mind should not get distracted by anything else. And of course, the residents of Vrindavan, they cannot stop thinking about Krishna even for half a moment. That is the level of their Krishna consciousness. So gradually, slowly, we have to progress to this because Krishna says something very important. And I will finish with this. In the 14th chapter of the 11th canto, he talks about the momentum of your mind. He says to Uddhava, "My dear Uddhava, if you absorb your mind in sense gratification, then your mind will be carried away in the currents of sense gratification. It will just be carried away. But if you, on the other hand, fight against this and force your mind to be absorbed in me," then Krishna tells to Uddhava, "then naturally, very naturally, your mind will be absorbed in me." So wherever we place our mind, that mental focus, it builds with it a momentum. If we focus on Krishna repetitively, then we'll find over time it will become easier and easier and easier, and it will be harder. Even if you want to think about sense gratification, it won't very easily come back into your mind. So we can try that, to always think of Krishna somehow or other. Okay, so I'll finish here. Thank you very much. If there's any questions, comments. Okay.
Is it consistency of practicing your sadhana? Is it consistency is what will eventually make your will stronger to fight Maya?
Yes, most definitely. Yeah.
So just practicing regulatory principles and doing your sadhana every day.
Yeah, that is it. But it has to be done in the association of devotees. Okay, that's the two basic things Srila Prabhupada said for initiation, but then at the same time it has to be done with devotees. Quality, quantity doesn't matter so much, because if consistency is not there, then what's the point in quality? It's like one day you chant 64 rounds and then the next day you don't chant anything. You chant 1 round, 2 rounds. So quality and quantity is good if consistency is there. First, work on your consistency. If it's just 1 round a day, consistently, day after day, get used to chanting 1 round. Then you can build on your quality and your quantity. So consistency is very important. Yes, Madhuri. This is a story from the Mahabharata. Uh-huh. Ah, okay. Yeah, he is a good Kshatriya, but then because he's inattentive, then Kali Yuga infiltrates him, and he ends up. Yeah, so that's the part of the story which is not, because that story it's more to glorify the faithfulness of Damayanti. So it's mainly focused on the Swayamvara part, where she chooses Nala, but then what happens after is not so much spoken. So Maharaj was focusing on that part of the story, about how we should be attentive in our Krishna consciousness. Otherwise we're exposing ourselves to Maya and to Kali like that. Okay, thank you very much. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki jai.